anniversary
Oh my God.
of her murder.
And in case you guys don't, this is a case that happened when I was in high school, so I remember it very vividly. I think she was also attending Academy of Our Lady.
Yeah, 16 years old.
16 years old, beautiful young woman, so bright, intelligent from what everyone is saying, found brutally murdered. I mean, this is a heinous crime.
Yeah.
Her house at the time was kind of down the hill from the Department of Corrections.
Near DOC. She was spending the summer with her father, who has since passed away.
Right. And so, yeah, that's going to be the next podcast from Bree with Crimes Without Convictions. I mean, there's just so many stories that people have been talking about. You started a really great conversation, Bree, with the drop of that podcast because I know it was about Deanna Oli, but people talked about not just that case, but a lot of other cases in Guam history.
Mm-hmm.
That because there's kind of like a gap. Like Shawn Gumataotao is joining us here on the Zoom. Shawn, and you're very experienced, so you can jump in on this too. But there's kind of like a gap in our ability to access like files and, you know, media stories, videos for pretty much anything before, like, what would you say?
I want to say mid-90s.
Yeah, mid-90s. And this isn't just with art. Like, we have a ton of tapes back there, archives of so many stories and interviews going back to, you know, I mean, the late 90s. But this is also media-wide across the board for Guam media. I mean, with whether it's, you know, any of the newspapers. I mean, we were, you know, or Guam Cable News or anything. You can't really Google. Like, let's say I wanted to Google the Abati case. You type it in, nothing comes up because a lot of the archives for the media haven't been digitized yet. So it's a challenge, right? But what we do have is we have cops, prosecutors, detectives
case agents
who have worked these cases and
that are still here,
right,
and remember and worked on these cases. So yeah, I'm interviewing former Chief of Police James Marquez today, along with Sergeant Joe Tayama, and they both were with the I guess Criminal Investigation Division.
right. Shawn, is there a particular case that really sticks out in your mind that kind of falls in this like in this genre?
You know, when first off, good morning, you guys.
Good morning.
I think when I started to listen to your podcast, Sabrina, it was the Bo Burnham trial actually jumped out and just had a lot of reminders of that. Because remember, it was front and center across every platform. And when I mean platform, radio, TV, print, and a lot of resources we put at KOM at the time to kind of sit there in trial. And it wasn't those days, guys, where you can kind of go in maybe on a passing day. You would have to sit in the trial. There was no cameras allowed. Cameras were not allowed in court until 1999, and an effort that Sabrina, myself, and I believe Jason just started when we started to get cameras in the court. And then since then, it has really changed the way that we look at jury trials and the way that we look at the justice system. And your podcast, Sabrina, looking at the amount of time, looking at the kind of the details, it for guys like me who was on the desk, it opens up old wounds.
Mm-hmm.
It was very difficult at the time to be able to report that to the community. It just was very challenging, and we had some great people around us that were able to help us make sense of it all.
Yeah. And Nestor actually was, I want to say maybe he was news director at the time. I know he was.
I think he was during the Mesa time, right? He was.
Right. Yeah, I heard you talking to him about it yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
But Shawn, you know, we're talking about this KOM podcast network, and it's Crimes Without Convictions. We also have the Hafadeza podcast, the One Micronesia podcast, Boca Talks. There's also Ken Nicholas and his esports gaming podcast, and Shawn Gumataotao and his That's It, That's All podcast. Shawn, I mean, that's it, that's all. You can't really figure out what your podcast is about from the title. So can you give us maybe a little synopsis of what listeners can expect when they hear one of your podcasts?
Yeah, you know, first off, I'm very excited to be a part of the KOM Podcast Network. And when I started the podcast back in January, I got to say, if you're a podcaster and you are making content today, to be a part of this group really is a big deal for myself, for the podcast in general. But the whole idea of that's it, that's all. It actually, I had the privilege that when I was back in the States to interview my dad, the guy who's kind of his saying, that's it, that's all, used to drive us crazy. But it's the looking at things, keeping words very simple and looking at issues that way. So the podcast has done everything from looking at politics. Turning 50, I didn't believe would be a big deal. The Jones Act, which my son he was the one who said, "Dad, can you do a podcast about the Jones Act?" Here's a 16-year-old boy asking to do a podcast about the Jones Act. I think he was trying to get away with some kind of project at Notre Dame.
Right, yeah.
But the whole idea of it all is really just to kind of give my 2 cents about issues and be very succinct. And it's been a very exciting project for me, and I'm really enjoying every single bit of it. And this week, the podcast is talking about medical liability insurance and the whole idea of reform. So it's really, I guess, over time, I wasn't really going to do it. But then as the issue started to come up and spending time to research it, it actually has become a very important issue that I think that every one of us should be looking at today.
I'm pretty sure you caught the hearing last night.
I did. I was up until I passed out at 10, whatever o'clock it was, near the end. I was listening throughout the night, and very impassioned testimony from not only families who were impacted by maybe, call them bad doctors, because I think that's what this issue has now polarized this community into. It's good doctors, bad doctors. But there's no question that the reform is an important thing. I don't know if you guys know, and I'm going to talk about it in the podcast, but this whole idea of medical malpractice is the 3rd leading cause of death in America. Behind cancer and behind heart disease. So when we think of the issue, it's not something that just came out of nowhere. It's been kind of stewing. The pandemic has complicated matters because now we're putting even more pressure on a group of folks who've been asked to step forward and do more with less. And obviously, this pandemic, and with this, say if the bill goes into play, a lot of people would say maybe the pandemic and the response to it might go down because no one's willing to risk their entire license to do certain things that would go beyond the scope of what they do on a daily basis.
All right. But this clip we're about to play is not about medical malpractice, is it?
No, it's not. It must be from this last week's podcast. It's about online.
It's the
Hold on, Jay.
Yeah, it's the episode of Shawn's podcast, which we're actually going to feature today. Because Shawn, you're recording your Bill 112 podcast later on today. That's going to drop tomorrow. So make sure to subscribe, everybody. You can get Shawn's podcast. Just find all the links on our timeline or at KUM.com/podcast. You can get them on Apple Podcast, Amazon, Audible, Spotify, Google Podcast. But this one is Shawn's thoughts, right, Shawn, on online learning, what you've been through as an educator, as a parent, and then just what you've been able to see as people just being locked into their computers and going to school, which I'm sure for you is like a dramatic paradigm shift.
Yes, it absolutely has been.
All right, so let's play this clip now from Shawn Gumataotao's That's It, That's All podcast on the KUM Podcast Network.
My kids' consumption of knowledge and the techniques needed to help them stay with the pace of others of their generation in these times. They have plenty of technology. Heck, I saw a computer for the first time in 1981. My mom bought me a Commodore VIC-20. The tech was similar to the ones I had in class at Woodrow Wilson Elementary School in San Leandro, California. I was in the 5th grade. My mom wanted to be sure I and my 2 brothers didn't get behind the times. While those 2 bored easily, I spent many hours trying to replicate the programs we did in class. Call it homework, if you will. I did play the games on it regularly, like Pac-Man and Asteroids. I was always trying to hack something. I had no clue of the machine language or coding, tapping the keys I thought would get me closer to my favorite Star Wars characters in space. Today, MacBook Pros and smartphones lay around the rooms of all of my kids. That Star Wars movie is now being watched on an Apple TV in my living room. Pac-Man has been replaced by Call of Duty on Xbox. My kids do other things, thankfully, than spend all their time online. But when the push to online learning happened, they responded better than I thought. These Generation Z kids were able to traverse the Google Classrooms even better than some of their teachers. My kids are very fortunate to have good internet, meaning the research for their projects were easier for them than some of their classmates relegated to slower speeds via a MiFi device. But when they were done with school, it was right to YouTube or Netflix to de-stress from the online day of classes. Discovery seems to be more immediate, with lasting effects for my kids and many their age. I jump onto the web and need to step away and take a walk in my yard to get away from all the information that the information superhighway is presenting itself today. Scanning and reading seems to be techniques my kids and college students seem to be at odds with each and every day of every lesson and ahead of those teaching sessions. Just as Draves noted on this matter, the scan technique is key to learning online today. Every person is different for sure. How school-age kids and college students learn today is a stark contrast to how I and my wife and my parents learned when we were in school. Learners today do have good etiquette online, the netiquette, if you will. The learning is coming across at least 2 of the 5 senses at the very minimum. What is online today, though, is still something that has to be monitored and regulated by each individual person. That is how you got to my podcast. That is how you get the latest scores from the sports arena. That is how you were able to experience the latest tunes on the Billboard Top 100. But face-to-face learning is still there and ready to get back to some kind of normal in these extraordinary times. There has got to be some balance between online and in-person learning at some point for it all to be successful for teachers and students alike. I've learned in recent years that the online environment should not be viewed as this isolationist type of behavior of young people. In fact, we should embrace how it helps them grow as a person in this year, 2021. It certainly helps when these settings bring collaboration. Learning from other learners is key to growth in today's world. We should all agree that there are generational differences in learning. Understanding the generational learning characteristics of the generations is key to instructors like me and a parent like me. Coming from another generation should make us more sensitive to their learning needs.
Oh, dang, freaked me out there with that explosion.
Yeah.
Shots
No,
fired.
his
My
podcast is
kids
very,
say
very
the
good.
same. It's called a transition.
Yeah.
Yeah. And actually, the one thing, and
You could have used a whoosh, maybe.
and we have actually known Shawn and of course his lovely wife Trish for many, many years. Trish actually makes a couple cameos in your show, right, Shawn?
She does at least part of it, the ad.
So subscribe and remember that was not the episode in full, everybody. That is a snippet,
Just a little sniblet.
a mere fraction of Shawn's thoughts on online learning and a whole bunch of stuff. So make sure to check us out. Go on KUM.com and hit the podcast link up at the top under listen, and you can subscribe to not only Shawn's podcast on whatever audio platform you're listening to, so that way it gets automatically delivered. You don't have you subscribe once, you get it every single time he drops an episode, including tomorrow's big one. I'm looking forward to that, Shawn, to see what you say about Bill 112.
Yeah, Jason, thanks for the plug again. And, just one other thing on the podcast. It's always designed so that when you leave your house, say, like I live in Talofofo, I drive to Tamuning. If I was to listen to my podcast right now, it would basically get me to my destination in that time frame. So it's designed to kind of get you where you need to be on Guam. Right. So it's one end of the island to the other for the most part, at least in terms of the sweet spot in terms of time. But yeah, this week's podcast is about this whole idea of medical liability reform and my 2 cents. And then looking at the bill, looking at some of the statements that were made on this program here on the link and others, it's a chance for kind of give, again, my perspective. This last night also really opened my eyes too. I mean, I did, like you did, Chris, I sat and listened to the folks, and I think that it's a big deal for lawmakers. They're really in a really interesting spot to come up with this at this time. But if you didn't listen,
I like
go
that.
on YouTube and listen to Dr. Yashihiro's testimony last night. If you look at all of it in totality, the Monday is going to be important too. But Dr. Yashihiro really lays out a kind of an interesting history of it because of his role. I mean, he's been practicing, and he's a dentist. He's been practicing in Guam a long time.
Right.
And he offers up such, an interesting perspective, historical perspective that the intent of the bill didn't have. The senators who were authors missed that boat to talk about. And he put it in such a way that's so easy to understand. So if you're a doctor or you're a patient, if you listen to Dr. Yashihiro, it really says a lot about what this is all about and how we should look at it. And he put it right back on them and how lawmakers will be looked at if this is passed or not.
Shawn, thanks for your time. And when that episode drops, shoot us a little clip, and we'll be sure to get it out maybe Monday on the day of the public hearing.
Hey, not a worries. And when I think about the online one, I'm teaching at UAG. I just started my online class for the summer, but we're back on in the fall, which I think is going to have to end up being another podcast because we're all going to be getting back to some sort of normal at some point. Right. But guys, thanks for pushing it. And I'm so happy to be part of the KOM Podcast Network.
We're happy to have you, Shawn. Take it easy, my friend.
Thanks, Shawn.
Thank you, bro.
Okay.
Have a great week.
Okay. It's 7:28. We're getting a bunch of senators who were at the hearing last night. You better plug that in.
Yeah.
Charger. But first, let's go and play a couple of these clips. We're going to play this clip from Dr. Jolene Uggenbree.
Strip wasn't
From the public hearing last night. This is the first public hearing. There's another one on Monday. And then I believe at the close of this one last night, Speaker